I want to start out talking about China because, right now with the tariffs and with Taiwan and everything going on, we've seen a lot in the headlines recently about China and some of the trade wars, and we've heard a lot about military-age men coming across the border into America. I want to hear your thoughts and insights on China because according to you and others, China has admitted 2 cyber attacks against America already and for quite some time. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, that is a fair statement. They let slip during a meeting overseas, which were several fairly high-ranking U.S. officials, the notion that they were behind a number of cyber attacks and various forms of cyber shenanigans over the years. It's a kind of a statement of the obvious in a sense. And I think whenever you talk about China, the Chinese regime, we're not talking about the people, the population. They're great. The history, the culture. There's so many fascinating and good aspects of China as a country. But we're talking about the regime led by Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party and their intel apparatus. A couple of things that are really important to remember with them is that they play the long game. They look at the world and they look at history and they look at time, the movement of time, differently than we do or the West does. And by that, they really do have a long vision. Right? We tend to get, I think, in the U.S., and if you just drill down and narrow it down to our operations, our intelligence operations, we tend to have ADHD, right? We're always chasing the next, shiny tinfoil ball like a raccoon. And so our time frame tends to be very condensed. The Chinese look at it differently, right? They have a much longer view, more patience in what they do, and that includes their intelligence operations, which leads me to the other part that's always important to keep in mind is that decades ago, the Chinese regime decided that the way they were going to get to the top of the food chain was by essentially bypassing the heavy lift of research and development, right? All that work. And they were just going to hoover up everything they could get their hands on, and not just from the US, but from the West in general, to jumpstart and to bypass the processes of research and development, all the work and the costs that go into that. And that's what they've been doing. And, whether you're talking about putting a Intel operative into the U.S. as a undergrad student who then his only job is to get good grades and then go to grad school. And then their only job is to get a good job after that and then find another one. And eventually you got 20 or 30 years down the road and they're a producing Intel asset because now maybe they're sitting inside of Corning or IBM or SAIC or what, name any company that they may find of interest. And so their ability over the years, through a variety of means, to engage in the theft of intellectual property, research and development, economic intelligence, it has really jump-started their efforts. And it has cost the U.S. and the West an incalculable amount of money, a lost opportunity, jobs, a variety of other things. And we're just now getting our heads around that notion, right? The Intel community, I think, has known it for quite some time, but it's become more of a public understanding just over the past few years.
Let's talk about this for a second, because we hear about this, we watch TV series like The Americans. We look at that like it's some kind of spy fiction. But what you're saying is this isn't some conspiracy theory, that they are playing the long game. They do get people insinuated into American society, into the fabric of society, and they adapt. They look like, act like, feel like, integrate into society, but they never lose sight of the fact that they're here to gather information, and it may be military information, it may be corporate intelligence or whatever, and they're constantly feeding that back to China, which is kind of like the generic drug companies do. They don't spend hundreds of millions of dollars on R&D. They wait until somebody like Eli Lilly or whatever does it, and then they just come in and become the generic, and the first generic in the water gets 40% of the business, but they have no R&D cost in it, and that's what China's doing. They're sending people over here getting all of our work and taking it back over there. That's really happening, and it's going on right now as you and I are speaking.
Yes. Look, the FBI, the Bureau, they're busy almost every week opening up a new counterintelligence case related to the Chinese regime, to the PLA and the intel apparatus. And they do it through a variety of means, right? So it's not just, as you mentioned, the Americans, which was based on an actual Russian situation on the East Coast a few years back, where we had a cell of essentially sleeper assets who their job was to assimilate into the U.S. lifestyle and develop relationships. And maybe you'll meet somebody. Maybe you're standing on the sidelines of your kid's soccer game on a Saturday, and you find yourself talking to somebody who works for an interesting financial institution or works at a manufacturing plant producing aircraft parts. It doesn't matter, because all information may at some point be of benefit. So that was their job. These Russians that were there on the East Coast, they just literally become part of the fabric of society, see who you meet, and see about developing that, and then hand them over to someone who is a little bit further down the line within that intel organization, to then start to develop and start looking for access points, start looking for weaknesses, start looking for points of leverage. And it could be something very simple. The Chinese regime does the same thing, and they also do a variety of other efforts. A lot of information they hoover up just through academic institutions, right? And whether it's attending conferences, developing relationships with visiting professors, again, maybe I, find out that my son, I'm living in the States, and my son is going to school with someone who works at a company of interest. Next thing you know, I'm trying to figure out, well, how can I get them on side? How do I start to develop a relationship with them? A lot of times the Chinese regime is looking for first or second generation Chinese Americans, and they play off of that historical relationship, that connection back to China, to try to get them on side. And whether they're unwitting or whether they eventually become witting assets or cooperative contacts, doesn't matter. The Chinese, again, they play the long game. They have patience. They're willing to invest a lot of time and resource into this. And all information potentially is of interest to them. They've got the motivation and the resources to grab it all and then sift through and see what could benefit one of their pseudo state companies, perhaps.
If you're 64 or older, this is important. Have you ever tried to pick a Medicare plan and felt like you were nailing Jell-O to a tree? Or visited the Medicare website and found it about as useful as a steering wheel on a mule? Yep, we've all been there. Medicare is confusing, and many of those helpful brokers only recommend plans that pay them the most. That's why you've got to talk to my partners at Chapter. They're the only advisors that compare every Medicare plan nationwide to find what's actually best for you. They've saved the average senior $1,100 a year. They'll even help if you're hit with wrongful medical bills. The best part, their service is free. They can review your options in under 20 minutes. Call 352-845-0659 to talk to an advisor today. Let me ask you this. I work a lot with Tom Homan with Homeland Security and ICE, and they tell me that in the last few years, we've had as many as 30,000 Chinese come across the border, most of them down around San Diego, and that an uncomfortable number are military-age men. And they tell me that they are in shape, flat-bellied, all have the same kind of boots on, all have the same kind of backpacks on, and they're coming across the border. How do they get here? And we don't know where they are. Who are these people? Why are they here?
Yeah, it's interesting. The human trafficking industry and the routes that are taken, it's very organized. It's very established. It is a, think of it as a corporation, basically. I mean, there's not just one, but there's a number of them out there engaged in that sector human trafficking, of moving humans to various parts of the world. It's not unlike the gray arms market. People imagine that to be, dodgy and shady, and, it exists in, in this sort of murky world. And it's also a very organized, very buttoned up business, right? But with the Chinese individuals coming across the border, a lot of them through the San Diego sector, look, are a number of them out there just looking for a better life, just looking to try to find, a job and do it? Of course there are, right? But you would have to be incredibly naive or just willfully partisan to believe that there aren't some that are being sent across to take advantage of that, at the time, the chaos of that open border, essentially, to make their way over. And it doesn't take a lot. If you've got, say, the number you cited, 30,000, but doesn't take 30,000 of them to create a national security concern. You could be talking about a dozen or 2 dozen, right, that would do that, because if you only have those few, but they're willing assets of, let's say, the PLA intel apparatus, and their job is to be on the ground and recce or reconnaissance sites that are of interest, infrastructure sites, whatever it may be, and just provide information, right? Gather information. Maybe that's all it is. People roll their eyes sometimes when you talk about things like this. They go, you're just being, as you pointed out, a conspiracy theorist, right? You're paranoid. Well, again, if you imagine that the Chinese regime, which has been so aggressive and interested in gathering information on the U.S. and others over the years, didn't look at the chaos in the U.S. southern border during the previous administration and think to themselves, let's take advantage of this, just like a well-resourced terrorist organization would, right? Or the cartels, where they're looking for other opportunities, then I can't help you, because someone with that mindset doesn't appear to be living on the same planet.
Is there any theory under which we don't believe that China hasn't mapped out our energy grid?
So when you talk about the Chinese regime, no, they've been very active over the years, poking and prodding at our infrastructure, at the U.S. infrastructure. And again, look, they're equal opportunity, right? They're doing this to a lot of countries out in the West. And what they're doing is they're putting together they've already put together a playbook for the next, however you want to call it, the next big global conflict, right? Because at that point, they will have already identified weaknesses in our power grids and our water treatment facilities and transportation hubs, the way that cash moves, the way that fuel moves. They will have identified all the important things on the infrastructure in the U.S. as an example, because if there is, God forbid, knock on wood, whatever you do, if there is that next big global conflict, and say, it's the West against the Chinese, hopefully that never happens, but you got to game out all the scenarios, then the idea will be to bring the pain to the homeland as quickly as possible and change that mindset of the population. And if you shut down power and you shut down the ability to move food, if you shut down running water, safe water, if you shut down the ability to get pharmaceuticals or cash, whatever it may be, on the home front, then the impact is devastating, right? Because people don't have a high tolerance for pain, basically, I don't think, the average person. And that will dictate the way that the government will deal with that conflict. So everybody, I'm not saying, look, the U.S. does the same thing. We better hope the U.S. does it, better than anybody else. But in other countries in the West do the same thing if they've got the resources. They're all out there putting together these playbooks to understand how to do that, right? If you take down the satellite systems and suddenly people don't have GPS, God forbid they don't have TikTok, then again, you're changing the mindset of the population that you're fighting against, and that's a powerful thing.
I assume that U.S. intelligence is mapping out the infrastructure, the energy grid, the cyber status of those that we suspect would do us harm or wish us ill. I assume that we're looking at Korea and China and Russia and others that would try to create chaos in the United States. I assume we're doing the same thing that we suspect them of doing.
Yes, and again, the same people out there that view this as a community of nations, and if we didn't do something like that, then everybody else would stop doing it. They tend to roll their eyes and say, well, but the U.S. does it too. Well, you better hope that we do. And we do. Look, I'm subjective. This is probably exactly what people would think I'm going to say, but I think the U.S. has the finest intel organization, certainly with the CIA. Look, I'm also partial to the UK's, agencies. I think 5 and 6 in the UK are extremely good, very good. I think we, in the U.S. And the NSA and some others are the benchmark in this. And yes, we have been doing that because it's not just for defensive purposes. It's for that potential scenario down the road. And you better hope, as a citizen of the country that you live in, that your country is prepared for a potential problem. Because just like with another pandemic, we'll have another pandemic. Yes, we'll have another conflict. It's just, unfortunately, it appears to be human nature.
This message is sponsored by Greenlight. Parenting gets easier as kids get older. They can grab their own snacks and even help clean up, sometimes. But what never gets easier? Teaching them about money. Kids won't truly learn to manage money until they get hands-on experience. And now that's where Greenlight comes in. Greenlight is a debit card and money app for families with games and a chores feature. Kids learn to connect hard work with rewards. My life would have been so much easier if I had Greenlight for my kids first. Greenlight is the #1 family finance and safety app, trusted by millions of families. Don't wait to teach your kids real-world money skills. Start your risk-free Greenlight trial today at greenlight.com/Phil. That's greenlight.com/Phil to get started. greenlight.com/Phil. What is our level of preparedness, would you say? Are we poorly prepared, fairly prepared, well prepared? Where would you put the United States?
Yeah, I'd say we're, when you talk about the infrastructure and the hardening of the infrastructure against attacks, I'd say we're okay, but there are some soft targets out there. Look, the power grid, just as an example, right? We've got 3 grids, basically, the East, the West, and Texas. And those grids were built. The power structure was built. Think about it like a patchwork quilt, right? It was cobbled together over years. And it certainly was never built with the idea that it's got to withstand a terrorist attack. That was not top of mind in the 1940s as we were building out a power grid. And certainly not that it could withstand a cyber attack. So there have been efforts. It's Washington, D.C., so efforts coming out of Congress tend to always be slow. There have been some efforts. It is a very costly enterprise to try to improve and harden security on something like a power grid. But there's awareness, and that's a good place to be, right? I just say that there are a lot of potential targets out there. And there are a number of entities looking to identify those that are the weakest. So, yeah, the work's cut out for us. It doesn't sound like a very cheery assessment, does it?
No, but it's a motivational assessment. I know just a few years ago, we had an extremely harsh winter in North Texas, and the reports were we were within minutes of the grid going down, and it would have taken, they said, months and months to get it back up through just poor management of the real central power stations and all. And that was without an attack. That was just from demand. And I just wonder if we get in a situation like that, somebody comes by with a .22 rifle on the highway. I mean, it was. I think you're given a pretty rosy assessment from what I understand of the Texas grid. I don't know about the East and West, but I appreciate the encouragement, but I wonder if we're more vulnerable than we think.
You're absolutely right. We're definitely more vulnerable than we think, than certainly the average citizen thinks. That is absolutely true.
I've put together a very fact-based map I'd like you to take a look at and comment on, because this is a map of where China has come in and purchased, quote, farmland. There's an overlay. The red is where they've purchased farmland, and this is a national map, so you can imagine how many thousands and thousands of acres that red represents. And then I've got an overlay of the military installations that they've decided to purchase this farmland around in many cases. And some of these are really strategic military installations. How do you feel about the Chinese coming in and buying up all of this land? We can't do that in China, but they come in and buy all of this, particularly around our strategic military installations. And some of them have like wind farms. And so they've got these big towers up, but they don't have any propellers on them. I mean, we've got videos.
Which should be a clue. Yeah, that should be a clue.
Yeah, there's a clue. They've got cameras on them, not propellers up there, and we're allowing it to happen. I had a guy on, a wonderful guy, that actually, he was a black farmer, and at one time in his life, his great-grandfather had sharecropped that land. Then they were able to hang on to it, and he now owns that and has added to it. And he said they have paid so much for the farmland around his land and driven the prices up so high that he may now lose his land because he can't afford to pay the taxes on it because they've driven the prices up so high by coming in and paying whatever they had to get the land.
Yeah, there is no coincidence. That map's a really good one. There's no coincidence, between the location of land that's purchased and the location of sensitive U.S. facilities. Look, I mean, Canada is by far the largest landowner, foreign landowner in the U.S. And you could do a similar map, and despite the vast amount of land that the Canadian purchasers own, it wouldn't correlate to sensitive facilities the way that this, in relative terms, small amount of purchases correlate to sensitive facilities. And it's, oftentimes it's just because, look, they roll in through a seemingly innocuous entity, a commercial enterprise, to say, we'd like to set up a soybean factory here. And, the town council looks at it and goes, great, yeah, sure, we'll sell you at this very attractive price. That's terrific news. And there's no due diligence done, really, to say the least. Now, the awareness has changed, and that's a good thing. But look, for years, as an aside, not just from the land purchases, but the Chinese regime was in the business of selling ridiculously inexpensive, again, it's all relative, but inexpensive telecoms gear to regional carriers out in much of the same area where a lot in the West, certainly, the sensitive facilities are. So, and why would they doing that? Why would they sell equipment under, actual, profitable cost to these U.S. regional telecoms carriers? Well, it's because they wanted their gear up on these towers, right? And it's, they can manipulate that gear to do whatever they want. So if they want to suddenly turn on a camera and view off in the distance, look, we're talking about very, sophisticated equipment, view off in the distance an air base and just, make note of traffic coming in and out. It's like the Chinese control of the ports, down in the Panama Canal, right? Just having intelligence about what U.S. ships, particularly military vessels, are coming and going. That's good intel. Right? People always say, well, it's not, it doesn't appear to be a national security secret, but, information, a lot of information has value that you don't necessarily see when you first look at it. So, and the Chinese regime, again, their intel apparatus is very good at just hoovering it all up. So, yeah, I look at this map, and the only upside to it, I believe, is that there's much more awareness now within the U.S. government. So foreign purchases are being scrutinized much more carefully than they were. And that's a good thing.
Yeah, it's a good thing.